Hey guys, tonight we're settling into the timbers of a pirate sloop somewhere off the American coast in the early 1700s, riding out one long, dark night between a lookout's first cry of sail-ho and the grey light of morning. We'll swing in a hammock 14 inches wide, listen to a quartermaster settle a dispute with a worn set of dice instead of a fist, sit through a storm that took a real ship named the Wider to the bottom off Cape Cod in April of 1717, and stand on the deck of a sloop at Ocracoke Inlet the night before Blackbeard's last sunrise. Along the way there's a boy of about 11 who signed on for a share of the plunder, a surgeon forced into service who hummed hymns while he worked, and a set of handwritten articles that gave men on a pirate ship more say over their own fate than almost anyone else at sea in that century. Welcome to the Middle Watch, 400 years back, where the only light comes from a swinging lantern and the only sound is water against a hull. Go ahead and dim the lights now, and if you've got a fan nearby, let it hum low and steady, like wind moving through rigging you can't quite see. You're warm right now, wherever you're lying. That won't be true where we're going. So get comfortable, let your shoulders drop, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The sun is going down over open water, and somewhere below your feet, a ship is groaning the way old wood groans when it cools. The smell hits you before anything else does. Tar and salt pork gone slightly rancid, and the particular mustiness of 100 wet ropes coiled too close together. You're standing near the mainmast of a small pirate sloop, maybe 70 feet long, somewhere in the warm waters off the American coast in the early 1700s, and the sun is dropping fast toward a flat horizon. 6 bells have just rung for the second dog watch, around 7 in the evening by the ship's reckoning, and for a moment the whole vessel seems to exhale. Sails slack, voices drop. Someone is laughing near the forecastle over something you can't quite hear. It feels, for exactly as long as it takes to notice it, almost peaceful. Here's the thing about that feeling. Enjoy it, because it's rationed. A pirate sloop of this size might carry 80 to 100 men, where a merchant vessel the same length carried 20, and every one of those extra bodies needs somewhere to sit, sleep, eat, and avoid killing each other before morning. The peace of the second dog watch isn't the ship at rest. It's the ship taking a breath between shifts of 80 men trying to occupy the same 70 feet of pine and oak. Below decks, the air is already thickening, no ventilation to speak of, no portholes on the lower deck, just close, warm dark that will get closer and warmer as the night goes on. Somewhere forward, a bell will ring again in half an hour, and half the ship will trade places with the other half. That's not a comfort. That's just the next round. To understand tonight, you need to understand the bells, because the bells are the only clock this ship has, and they never stop. A ship's day is cut into 6 watches of 4 hours each, except 2, the dog watches from 4 to 6 and 6 to 8 in the evening, which are split short on purpose, so the same men don't stand the same miserable hours every single night. Every half hour within a watch, the ship's boy or whoever's nearest turns a half-hour sand-glass and strikes the bell once more, climbing from 1 bell up to 8, then starting again. You'll hear 8 bells tonight. You'll hear it more than once. Each time, it means one watch is ending and another is groaning awake to take its place. On a pirate ship, unlike a naval vessel, this system isn't imposed by an admiralty official who's never met you. It was voted on. Most crews, when they set their articles, sorted themselves into 2 watches, larboard and starboard, and agreed on the rotation together, the same way they agreed on almost everything else that governed their nights and days. That's worth sitting with for a second. The schedule that will keep you half asleep for the next 8 hours was a decision made by people you can see right now, coiling rope in the last of the daylight, not handed down by a king an ocean away. Small comfort, maybe, but it's real, and it's more than most sailors of this century ever got. The man walking the deck checking lashings before full dark is named Josiah Rook, and if you serve on this ship for more than a week, you will come to know him better than you know the captain. He's the quartermaster, second in command in name. but in practice the man who actually runs the ship day to day, distributes plunder, hears grievances, and settles disputes before they turn into knife fights. He carries a set of dice worn nearly smooth at the corners, and when two men argue over who gets first pick of a captured coat, or a better hammock spot, Rook is as likely to settle it with a roll as with an order. It sounds almost frivolous. It isn't. On a ship where nearly every man is armed and short-tempered, a coin toss that both sides agree to beats a fistfight that both sides remember. Rook lost 2 fingers on his left hand 3 years back, boarding a Portuguese merchantman off the Windward Islands, and he'll show you the stumps without much ceremony if you ask, because under this ship's articles, the same kind of written agreement nearly every pirate crew signed before setting out. An injury like that came with a payout. Somewhere around 400 to 800 pieces of 8 for a lost limb on some crew's articles, less for fingers, paid out of the common plunder before anyone else took their share. It's one of the strange. Almost tender mechanics buried inside an otherwise brutal trade get maimed in the company's service, and the company pays you for it, in writing, agreed to by vote before the anchor was ever raised. Rook doesn't dwell on it. He just keeps walking the deck, counting heads as the light fails, the way he does every single evening. Dinner tonight is salmagundi, and if that word means nothing to you, picture a wooden bowl holding whatever the ship happens to have: chopped meat, salted fish, hard eggs if there are any left, palm hearts or pickled vegetables, all of it doused in a sharp dressing of wine, oil, and spiced vinegar. It's not elegant, it is, by the standards of an early 18th century sailor's diet. Remarkably good. And that's not an accident. Here's what's easy to miss about pirate life. For all its violence, the food was often noticeably better than what the same men would have eaten on a merchant vessel or a navy ship. A merchant captain fed his crew as cheaply as the law and mutiny risk allowed. A pirate crew, having voted for their own captain and agreed on their own rations, tended to eat what they'd taken, and prize ships carried wine, sugar, citrus, live poultry, whatever cargo was aboard when it was captured. Rum flows tonight too, watered down into a mix called bumbo with sugar and nutmeg, partly because straight spirits on a crowded ship after dark is asking for trouble, and even a crew this loosely governed knew it. It's an odd kind of dignity, eating well on a vessel that will within a week likely be firing on another ship at close range. But dignity on this deck rarely looks the way you'd expect it to. By the top of the first watch, 8 bells, full dark now, the sun long gone into the water behind you, the night orders have been passed. Quietly. From captain to quartermaster, to the men standing first watch. There's no shouted chain of command here the way there would be on a navy frigate. No officer barking at men who have no say in their own posting. Rook simply walks the deck and tells each man where he's needed, and if a man disagrees strongly enough, he's allowed to say so. Within limits that everyone aboard understands without needing them written down twice. A lookout climbs into the rigging near the foremast, settling into a spot maybe 60 feet above the deck, where the roll of the ship becomes a wide, sickening arc, even on a calm night. His job for the next 4 hours is simple and nearly impossible. Watch the horizon in every direction for a sail. A light. A change in the colour of the water that might mean a reef. Miss a ship worth chasing, and the whole crew loses a payday. Miss a warship closing in the dark, and the whole crew loses considerably more than that. He has a name too. Ned Carrow, 17 years old by his own account, pressed into the crew 4 months back from a merchant ship the pirates overtook near the Bahama Banks. Whether he stays a pirate by the end of the voyage or slips away at the first port is, at 17, still genuinely undecided in his own head. Tonight, he just has to stay awake. Reading the sky is the closest thing the ship has to a weather report, and every experienced hand on deck does it without quite realizing they're doing it. A red sky at sunset, and tonight's was red, deep and sullen along the horizon, is already an old saying by the early 1700s, tracing back at least to a line in the Gospel of Matthew about red skies at evening meaning fair weather ahead. Nobody aboard has a barometer, that instrument won't become standard shipboard equipment for another century. What they have instead is decades of accumulated, half-superstitious, half-empirical observation. The colour of clouds at dusk, the direction a swell is running from, the way gulls behave before a blow, the smell of the air itself, which some old sailors swear changes before a storm the way it changes before rain on land. Tonight the signs are, by consensus among the older hands, ambiguous. The red sky is a good omen. But the swell has been building steadily from the northeast since noon, longer and heavier than the light evening wind alone would explain, which usually means weather is happening somewhere out past the horizon and sending its first messengers ahead of itself. Nobody says anything alarming out loud. But more than one man glances northeast before heading below, and Rook orders the deck cleared of loose gear a little more carefully than usual. Below decks, the night noises start in earnest once full dark falls, the endless creak of the rigging working against itself, the slap and gurgle of water in the bilge, and, inevitably, the scratch and scurry of rats, which no ship of this era, however well run, ever fully eliminates. Some crews keep a cat aboard specifically for this reason, and this one is no exception. A scarred grey tom named, without much imagination, Cook, prowls the hold most nights and is credited, probably with some exaggeration, for keeping the biscuit losses down to a merely infuriating level rather than a catastrophic one. Josiah Rook makes one more pass through the crowded lower deck before the first watch settles fully into its rhythm. Checking on the men who signed the ship's articles most recently, several of them taken, not entirely willingly, from a captured sloop 3 weeks back and given the standard pirate offer: sign the articles and share the risk and the plunder equally, or be put ashore at the next landfall with nothing. Most sign. Rook makes a point of speaking to the newest ones directly, by name, on their first few nights aboard, because a man who feels like a hostage behaves very differently in a boarding fight than a man who feels, even under duress, like he had some kind of choice. By the time the moon clears the yardarm red-tinted and low, the ship has gone as quiet as it ever gets. Somewhere out past the northeast horizon, that heavy swell is still building, though nobody aboard tonight will ever know its name. Before anyone settles fully for the night, the weapons come out, not because a fight is expected, but because a fight might not announce itself in advance, and a ship caught unarmed after dark has already lost. Cutlasses get checked and hung within easy reach along the rail. Boarding axes, useful for hacking through rigging or a locked door as much as for combat, are stacked near the main hatch. Pistols, loaded but with the pans covered against the damp night air, are laid out in rows on a strip of canvas near the companionway, ready to be snatched up by whoever's nearest if the alarm goes up. It's an oddly domestic ritual, watching 80 men lay out their weapons the way a household might set the table, and the men doing it treat it with roughly the same unremarkable routine. Most nights, none of it gets touched again until morning. But the one night it does get needed, there won't be time to go looking for a cutlass that's been left below in someone's sea chest, and every man aboard has learnt that lesson from someone else's near disaster, if not his own. Rook makes one final pass down the row of pistols, checking that the covers are seated properly against the coming dew, before he too finally allows himself to think about sleep. Sail gets reduced for the night as a matter of routine caution, not because the wind demands it, but because running full canvas through hours of darkness on unfamiliar or half-charted water is asking for a reef or a shoal to introduce itself the hard way. The topsails come in, leaving the ship under a more modest spread that trades speed for a wider margin of error. A trade every experienced sailing master makes without needing to be told, because charts of this coast in 1717 are, by any modern standard, closer to educated guesswork than to precision, full of gaps, guessed distances, and hazards nobody has bothered to mark yet. It costs the ship a few miles of progress overnight. Nobody complains. A pirate crew that prized speed above all else long ago worked out, usually the hard way, that a wrecked ship makes no prizes at all, and the sea has already claimed more than one overconfident captain who decided the extra miles were worth the risk. For an hour or so before the candles are meant to go dark, a knot of men gather near the forecastle with a battered fiddle and considerably more enthusiasm than skill, and the ship gets, for a little while, something close to festive. Someone starts a work song meant for hauling line, half remembered and reworked into something closer to a drinking song. And a dozen voices join in on the chorus badly enough that it circles back around to being genuinely enjoyable. It's not sanctioned entertainment exactly, but no one stops it either. So long as it stays this side of the curfew Rook will eventually come around to enforce. This is as close as this crew comes to anything resembling a shared community ritual, and it matters more than the noise level suggests. Men who've spent the day performing violence or the threat of it get, for this 1 hour, to simply be loud and off-key and briefly happy together before the bell rings again and the ship, one more time, goes back to work. A ship like this one is rarely more than a few weeks removed from somewhere like Nassau. On the island of New Providence in the Bahamas, a genuine if short-lived pirate haven that flourished between roughly 1713 and 1718, when the collapse of Spanish authority in the region and a near-total absence of any competing colonial government left the harbour effectively under pirate control. At its peak, contemporary estimates suggest somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 pirates used Nassau as a base at any given time, trading plunder for supplies, careening their ships on its beaches, and operating with a degree of open, undisguised freedom that no other port in the Atlantic world offered men in their trade. It didn't last. Woodes Rogers, appointed the first royal governor of the Bahamas specifically to end the arrangement, arrived in 1718 with a royal pardon in one hand and a naval squadron in the other, and within a few years the pirate republic that had briefly made Nassau the most lawless port in the hemisphere was gone, absorbed back into ordinary colonial administration. But for the men aboard tonight, Nassau or somewhere like it remains the closest thing to a hometown any of them have left. Not a place of belonging exactly, but a place where, for a little while, the rules of the wider world simply didn't reach. Every man aboard tonight signed the same set of articles before this voyage began, and the signing itself, by multiple surviving accounts from trial depositions, carried a small ceremony of its own. Absent a Bible, which not every ship carried, some crews are documented to have sworn their oath on a hatchet or boarding axe instead, hand placed flat against the cold iron, the same solemnity extended to a weapon that would, on a Bible-carrying ship, have been extended to Scripture. It's an improvisation that tells you something about how seriously these men treated the agreement itself, independent of the specific object used to formalize it. What mattered wasn't the axe or the book, but the shared understanding that breaking the oath meant answering to every other man who'd sworn it alongside you. Josiah Rook keeps the ship's actual written articles folded inside an oilskin pouch in his own sea chest, brought out and read aloud to any new man before he's asked to sign, a practice that ensures illiteracy, common enough among sailors of this era, never becomes an excuse for later claiming ignorance of a rule everyone agreed to together. The galley fire went out hours ago, doused deliberately well before dark, and it won't be lit again until well after sunrise, a precaution so universal across wooden sailing ships of this era that it barely counts as a rule anymore, more just an understood fact of shipboard life. An open cooking fire, contained though it might be within a sand-lined firebox, is simply too dangerous to leave burning through the night on a vessel built entirely of tar-soaked timber and stuffed with gunpowder, and every captain who ever forgot that lesson learned it, if he was lucky, from someone else's disaster rather than his own. It means tonight's remaining meal, such as it is, comes cold, the last of the evening's salmagundi, a heel of biscuit. Whatever rum remains from the earlier ration, nobody complains about it particularly. A cold supper is a small, manageable inconvenience, and every man aboard has made exactly the same trade dozens of times before, a slightly worse meal, in exchange for not burning to death in his hammock. It's the kind of quiet, sensible caution that never makes it into any pirate legend, and that keeps this entire crowded, flammable little world from becoming a very different kind of story before morning. Not every ship that felt a swell like this one lived to complain about it in the morning, and roughly 200 miles up the coast, on a night not so different from this one, that exact swell would end a story that had barely finished beginning. The mast comes down first. It happens fast, a crack like a gunshot somewhere above the deck, then the terrible groan of 100 feet of timber tearing loose from its rigging, and then men are screaming in a language of pure animal fear that has nothing to do with pirate bravado anymore. It's the night of April 26 into April 27, 1717, and the ship going down off the outer arm of Cape Cod, near what is now Wellfleet. Massachusetts is the wider galley, at that moment the flagship of the most successful pirate fleet in the Atlantic, commanded by a young Englishman named Samuel Bellamy. A nor'easter has been building all evening, the same kind of storm that still wrecks ships along that coast today, and the wider, riding low with a fortune in her hold, has no chance against it. Waves are breaking clean over the deck. Men who a week ago were among the wealthiest pirates alive are now clawing at broken rigging in freezing water, and within minutes most of them will be dead. Before we watch this ship go down, it's worth understanding how she got here, because the wider's story, more than almost any other pirate vessel's, is the story of one very fast ship making one very unlucky man briefly spectacularly rich. Samuel Bellamy, known to history, with a kind of nickname that tells you exactly what impression he made as Black Sam, was born in Devon, England, sometime around 1689, into a family with no money and no obvious path to the sea beyond ordinary merchant or naval service. The romantic version of his story, the one that gets repeated most often, involves a doomed love affair with a Cape Cod woman named Maria Hallett, whom Bellamy supposedly promised to return to a wealthy man. That particular thread has almost no contemporary documentation behind it, and belongs more to 19th century folklore than to Admiralty records. So treat it the way you treat any legend, a story people wanted to be true, layered onto a man whose real life needed no embellishment to be remarkable. What we do know, from more reliable sources, is that Bellamy turned to piracy around 1715 or 1716, sailing initially under a captain named Benjamin Hornigold before the crew. Following the standard pirate practice of electing their leaders by vote, chose Bellamy to replace him when Hornigold refused to attack English shipping. Within about a year, Bellamy had built a reputation and a small fleet, and in late February 1717, near the Bahamas, he captured the ship that would make him legendary, a slave galley called the Wider. This is the story of the Wider, the ship that turned an unremarkable young sailor into, by some estimates, the wealthiest pirate captain of the entire Golden Age for about 2 months. The Wider wasn't built for piracy. She was built in London in 1715 as a purpose-made slave ship, roughly 100 feet long, armed with 18 cannons for her own protection on the brutal Middle Passage route, and named for the West African port of Ouidah in what is now Benin, where she was meant to load captives. She was fast, galley-rigged, meaning she carried oars as well as sails, giving her speed even in light wind that few merchant vessels could match. That speed is exactly what made her irresistible to Bellamy when he caught her on her return leg from the Caribbean in February 1717, loaded not with enslaved people anymore, but with sugar, indigo, and a substantial quantity of gold and silver from trading. Bellamy didn't just plunder the Wider. He took her outright, giving her original captain his own smaller sloop as a consolation prize, a documented pirate practice, oddly generous sounding by modern standards, that let a defeated captain limp home with something rather than nothing. Bellamy then refitted the Wider with additional cannon, bringing her armament up to around 28 guns, more than enough to make her the most heavily armed pirate vessel then sailing the American coast. In the 2 months that followed, Bellamy's fleet, with the Wider as its flagship, took more than 50 ships. By the time she went down off Cape Cod, she was carrying an estimated 4.5 tons of silver and gold, much of it later recovered by divers, along with tens of thousands of coins from a dozen different nations, a genuinely staggering haul for a captain not yet 30 years old. What made the Wider's crew unusual, even by pirate standards, was who was aboard her. Contemporary accounts and later archaeological evidence both point to a crew that included English, Dutch, and African sailors. Some of the latter formerly enslaved men who had been taken from Caribbean plantations or captured slave ships, and, under the ship's articles, given the same vote and the same share as any other man aboard. Popular retellings, many tracing back to Captain Charles Johnson's dramatised 1724 General History of the Pirates, go further and claim explicit written promises of freedom and equal treatment. That specific claim should be held loosely, as legend layered onto a documented reality, rather than repeated as settled historical fact. What is better supported is grimmer and stranger at once. Bioarchaeological analysis of remains later recovered from the wreck site has confirmed a crew of genuinely mixed ancestry, consistent with the idea that a pirate ship, whatever its motives, offered a kind of rough equality under its articles that neither the Royal Navy nor any merchant marine of the era came close to matching. Not utopia, not deliberate abolition, but a system where a formerly enslaved man could in practice end up voting on the same matters and drawing the same share as the captain's oldest friend. That system, whatever its limits, is what made the deck of the Wider, on the night the storm found her, a genuinely unusual gathering of men from 3 continents, all of them, in the space of about 20 minutes, running out of time together. The storm that caught the Wider fleet built through the afternoon of April 26 and turned violent after dark, driving Bellamy's ships north along the outer coast of Cape Cod, in conditions that eyewitnesses assure, in depositions taken afterward by colonial authorities, described as among the worst anyone local could remember. Around 10 or 11 at night, with visibility nearly zero and the wind screaming out of the northeast, the Wider struck a sandbar roughly 500 feet off the beach, near what's now Marconi Beach in Wellfleet. The impact tore the mainmast loose, and within minutes the ship began breaking apart under the pounding surf, spilling men, cargo and treasure into freezing, churning water. Nearby residents later testified to hearing screaming carried on the wind, though the storm made any rescue attempt from shore impossible until first light. Of somewhere between 145 and 146 men aboard, only 2 are documented to have survived. Thomas Davis, a Welsh carpenter who had been forced into pirate service against his will, and John Julian, a young man of Mosquito indigenous descent who had served as the fleet's pilot. Both were later found and interrogated by colonial authorities, and it's largely from their testimony, along with depositions from local witnesses and correspondence from Massachusetts Governor Samuel Schuette, that we know what happened that night at all. For weeks afterward, bodies washed ashore along the beach in Wellfleet, and colonial officials sent men to recover what wreckage and treasure they could, while also working out what to do with the 2 survivors, one treated as an unwilling captive, the other, less fortunately, put on trial. Among the men lost that night was a boy named John King, and his story, more than almost anything else recovered from the wreck, is the detail that makes the Wider's loss feel less like a number and more like a death. John King was somewhere around 8 to 11 years old, records differ slightly, travelling with his mother aboard a merchant vessel Bellamy's fleet had captured earlier that spring, when, by contemporary account, the boy insisted on joining the pirates rather than staying aboard the captured ship, reportedly threatening to harm himself or his mother if he wasn't allowed to sign the articles. Whether that account is precisely accurate or somewhat embellished in the retelling, what's not in dispute is what divers found on the wreck site centuries later, a small human leg bone still inside a silk stocking and a finely made leather shoe sized for a child, recovered in the 1980s and identified through forensic analysis as almost certainly belonging to a boy roughly that age. It's one of the only instances anywhere in the archaeological record of a positively identified individual pirate victim, and it turns an abstraction, most of the crew died, into something considerably harder to hold at arm's length. Somewhere in that churning dark off Wellfleet, a child who chose piracy over safety, for reasons that will never be fully recovered, went into the water along with roughly 143 grown men, an unimaginable fortune in silver, and a ship that 2 months earlier had made its captain the wealthiest pirate on the Atlantic. By morning, all of it, gold, guns, and every life but 2, belonged to the sea. The Wider wasn't sailing alone that night. Bellamy's fleet at the time of the storm included several other vessels, among them a smaller prize sloop called the Mary Ann, which struck ground separately during the same nor'easter and whose crew survived largely intact, close enough to shore to be found, cold and frightened, the following morning. Their testimony, taken by colonial magistrates in the days afterward, became one of the more valuable sources historians have for reconstructing exactly how violent that night's weather actually was, since men who lived through it in a smaller, more survivable wreck could describe conditions the Wider's own crew never got the chance to report firsthand. By their account, and by the accounts of residents along the Wellfleet shore who watched what they could of the storm from relative safety, the wind that night was among the worst anyone local could recall, driving surf hard enough to move sand dunes and strip the beach down to a different shape than it had held the week before. It's the kind of storm that, on any other night, might simply have been endured. On this one, it found a ship riding low with 4.5 tons of silver and gold, sitting exactly where a shifting sandbar happened to wait. Thomas Davis and John Julian, the two men who survived, did not share the same fate once they reached shore. Davis, the Welsh carpenter, was able to demonstrate to the satisfaction of colonial authorities that he had been forced into pirate service against his will, a defence that required real evidence, not just a claim, since plenty of captured pirates tried the same argument and were hanged anyway. Davis's case held, likely because witnesses among the fleet's other prisoners could corroborate that he'd never willingly signed the articles, and he was ultimately released. John Julian's story ended less kindly. As a young man of Mosquito indigenous descent who had served the fleet as a pilot, a skilled and genuinely valuable role, since Mosquito sailors from the Central American coast were widely and specifically sought after in this era for their navigational knowledge of Caribbean and Atlantic waters, Julian was not extended the same legal consideration. Historical records suggest he was ultimately sold into slavery rather than tried or released, his skill as a navigator apparently valued by his captors more than his freedom ever was. It's a quieter, less dramatic tragedy than the storm itself, but no less real for how little attention it's received compared to the treasure. Samuel Bellamy himself left behind one fragment of recorded speech that has outlasted almost everything else about him, delivered, according to Charles Johnson's General History, to the captain of a captured ship who had criticised Bellamy's chosen profession. Bellamy reportedly replied that he considered himself a free prince with as much right to wage war on the world as anyone who did it with 100 ships and a fleet of soldiers, the only real difference between them being that one operated under the law's protection and the other didn't. Since this comes down through Johnson's often embellished account rather than a court record, it should be read as a colourful, possibly polished bit of pirate rhetoric rather than a verified transcript, but even as legend, it captures something true about how men like Bellamy seem to have understood their own choices. Not as a rejection of ambition, but as ambition pursued without a king's permission. Whatever he actually said that day, Bellamy never got the chance to say much of anything again after the night the Wider went down. His body was never identified among the dead that washed ashore at Wellfleet. The legal aftermath of the wreck played out that autumn in a Boston courtroom, where the surviving crew members from the Mary Ann, along with a handful of others, swept up in the investigation. Faced trial before a special admiralty court convened specifically to handle piracy cases in the colonies. On November 15th, 1717, 6 of the men were hanged along Boston's Charles River, their executions drawing a large public crowd, as public hangings routinely did in this era, part spectacle and part deterrent, aimed squarely at anyone in the audience who might be weighing the same career choice. It's a sobering coda to a story that, told only as a treasure and storm narrative, can start to feel almost adventurous. It wasn't. For the men who survived the wreck only to face a Boston gallows a few months later, the storm that killed most of their crewmates outright may in the end have simply delayed rather than prevented the same fate that awaited nearly everyone who chose this particular trade in this particular decade. The outer arm of Cape Cod, where the Wider went down, has earned a grim nickname across the centuries that followed her wreck, Sailors and historians alike have long referred to the stretch of shoals and sandbars running along that coastline as an ocean graveyard, a designation borne out by an extraordinary number of documented wrecks. By some estimates, several thousand vessels lost along the Massachusetts coastline across the full span of the age. Of sail, the wider simply the earliest and most famous among them. Shifting sandbars, sudden nor'easters, and a coastline that offered almost no natural harbour of refuge for a ship caught out in bad weather combined to make this one relatively short stretch of water disproportionately, catastrophically dangerous, long before Samuel Bellamy ever sailed anywhere near it. Local Wellfleet and Truro residents, in the generations after the wreck, grew accustomed to the sea periodically returning fragments of it to the beach unprompted. Coins, timber, the occasional human bone, long before anyone organised a formal search for the site at all. Folk knowledge of money washing up persisting as local legend for more than 2.5 centuries before Barry Clifford's. Team finally confirmed, with a bronze bell and careful archaeology, exactly what the local stories had been describing all along. The Wider herself, by the measurements recorded before her capture, weighed something in the range of 238 tons burden, a mid-sized vessel for her purpose, originally launched with 18 cannon before Bellamy's crew doubled that armament to bring her up to the roughly 28 guns she carried into her final storm. Lawrence Prince, her original captain on the slave-trading voyage Bellamy intercepted, walked away from the encounter with his life, and per the pirate custom of trading down, rather than leaving a defeated captain with nothing at all. A smaller sloop to sail home in, a strange mercy from a crew that had just taken everything else he'd been carrying. There's an odd, unresolved irony sitting inside that exchange, worth sitting with for a moment rather than rushing past. Prince sailed away that day believing he'd gotten the worse end of the encounter, robbed of a valuable ship and its cargo. Within 2 months, the vessel he'd lost would make his captors briefly the wealthiest pirates in the Atlantic, and within 4, it would be matchwood and bones scattered across a Cape Cod beach. Prince, whatever became of him afterward, at least got to keep living long enough to tell the story either way. Grief like that doesn't stay with a story for long on this coast. The tide comes in, the wreckage scatters, and somewhere south of Cape Cod, on a much quieter night, the ordinary business of staying awake at sea goes on exactly as it did before the Wider ever existed. 8 bells, and the cold has a different quality out here at midnight than it did at sunset, sharper, wetter, working its way through wool and canvas, in a way that makes you understand, quite suddenly, why sailors of this era die of things as mundane as chest colds turned to pneumonia. You're standing the middle watch now, the hardest 4 hours of the night by universal sailor consensus, running from midnight until 4 in the morning, when the body's own instincts are screaming for sleep and the ship needs you awake anyway. The watch bill that put you here tonight was, like almost everything else governing this cruise routine, agreed on before the voyage began, 2 watches, larboard and starboard, rotating through the day and night in staggered shifts thanks to those 2 short dog watches at dusk. Specifically so, no single group of men gets stuck with the middle watch every single night running. It's a small mercy, engineered on purpose into the schedule, and it matters more than it sounds like it should. A man who knows his misery is at least shared and rotated tends to grumble less than a man who knows he's been permanently assigned to the worst hours, simply because nobody with power liked him. Somewhere forward, the masthead lookout, Ned Carrow, still up there, 4 hours into a watch that started at 8, is fighting the same battle you are, staying awake on a job where the penalty for failure isn't a scolding, it's a missed prize, or worse. Article after article, drawn up and signed by crews across the Golden Age of Piracy, addresses exactly this problem. Because exactly this problem sank ships and got men killed. The articles attributed to the pirate captain Bartholomew Roberts, preserved, with the usual caveat that our source is Charles Johnson's sometimes dramatised general history, and should be read with a little scepticism about exact wording, reportedly required lights and candles to be put out by 8 at night, with any man who wanted to keep drinking after that hour required to do it on the open. Deck without a light, specifically to reduce the fire risk on a wooden ship packed with gunpowder. Falling asleep on watch on most documented pirate crews carried real consequences. Though rarely the death penalty popular imagination assigns it, more commonly it meant extra duty, a docked share of the next prize, or simply the lasting contempt of 80 other men whose lives had just been put at risk. That social pressure, on a ship this crowded, often did more work than any formal punishment could. Nobody wants to be the man whose name gets attached to the night the crew nearly ran aground because he dozed off in the rigging. Ned knows this. It's a large part of why, 4 hours in, cold and exhausted, he's still awake. Approaching a target at night requires a completely different set of skills than fighting one in daylight, and pirate crews, who preferred capturing ships through intimidation rather than actual combat whenever possible, got very good at it. Lanterns get shuttered or extinguished, orders get passed in a whisper down a human chain rather than shouted across the deck. Oars on a galley-rigged vessel get muffled with cloth wrapped around the looms to cut down the telltale creak and splash that carries astonishing distances across still water. The goal, 9 times out of 10, was never to fight. A merchant crew that woke to find an unfamiliar, heavily armed ship silently alongside them in the dark black flag barely visible against the night sky would very often simply surrender without a shot fired, which suited everyone involved. Pirates avoided casualties and damage to a ship they wanted to loot intact. Merchant sailors, who typically had no financial stake in defending their captain's cargo, avoided dying for someone else's profit. It's one of the odder truths of the era, the terrifying reputation pirates cultivated. All that black cloth and skull imagery existed largely to prevent violence rather than cause it, because a fight that could be avoided through fear alone was cheaper, safer, and faster than one that actually had to be fought. Tonight, this crew isn't hunting, but every man aboard, Ned included, has done this dance before, and everyone knows exactly how quiet a night like this is supposed to stay. It doesn't stay quiet for long. A little past 2 in the morning, a squall rolls through without much warning. Not the building nor'easter that caught the wider 200 miles north, just an ordinary violent burst of wind and rain that turns a calm midnight into 15 minutes of controlled chaos. All hands are called. Men who were asleep below are up and hauling on wet lines in the dark within a minute, working half by feel, shouting instructions to each other that get half swallowed by wind and rain. Josiah Rook is on deck within the same minute, directing men to the sheets and halyards that need attention most urgently, and it's here, in exactly this kind of moment, that the ship's egalitarian structure earns its keep in a way that has nothing to do with fairness and everything to do with survival. Every man aboard has at some point stood every job on this ship, because the articles typically required rotating duties rather than locking men permanently into one role the way a rigid naval hierarchy did. There's no single indispensable specialist whose absence would leave the ship helpless. Anyone can reef a sail. Anyone can man a pump. 15 minutes later, as fast as it arrived, the squall passes, leaving the deck soaked, the men breathing hard, and the ship, remarkably, no worse off than it was before. Somewhere below, the bilge pump keeps working through the last of the runoff, a steady, unglamorous rhythm that will continue, in some form, every single night of this voyage. The rats reappear almost immediately once things calm down, because rats on a wooden ship in 1717 are less an infestation than a permanent, unkillable fact of maritime life, and the squall has done nothing to discourage them. Ship's biscuit, the dense, long-lasting bread that makes up much of every sailor's diet on a voyage like this, is notorious across contemporary accounts for arriving already infested with small beetles nicknamed weevils, so reliably that some sailors developed the grim habit of tapping their biscuit on the table before eating, just to knock loose whatever had taken up residence inside. And eating in the dark specifically so they wouldn't have to look at it too closely. Cook, the ship's grey Tom, does what he can, and on a good week keeps the rat population from doing serious damage to the food stores. On a bad week, An entire barrel of provisions might be found gnawed through and ruined. A loss that, on a ship this size, everyone feels. Because everyone shares the same limited stores. It's a strange kind of solidarity, built entirely out of shared misery rather than shared affection. You're not fond of the man snoring 3 feet from your hammock necessarily, but you are absolutely furious alongside him when the rats get into the good salt pork. Somewhere in the dark, Josiah Rook makes his rounds one more time, checking that the squall did no lasting damage before the ship settles back into whatever passes for calm at 2:30 in the morning. It's during that round that Rook finds 2 men, one of them among the recently pressed crew, still finding his footing under the articles he signed under duress 3 weeks back, arguing bitterly over a dice game gone wrong. Voices rising toward the kind of confrontation that on a ship carrying this many armed and exhausted men can turn dangerous fast. Rook doesn't shout either of them down. He listens briefly to both accounts, produces his own worn dice, and offers the disputed stake settled by one final roll, binding on both sides, the outcome accepted before it's even thrown. It's a small moment. It will not appear in any Admiralty record or captain's log, because nothing happened worth recording. No blood, no mutiny, no lasting grudge. But it's exactly this kind of small moment, repeated dozens of times across a single voyage, that explains how 80 armed, frightened, often coerced men managed to share 70 feet of ship for months at a time without tearing each other apart. Not affection. Not brotherhood. Exactly. A system, agreed on, however unevenly, by vote, that gave every man a way to be heard that didn't require a knife. By 4 bells into the middle watch, the dice are put away, the argument forgotten, and the ship, cold and wet and crowded, is quiet again. Communication between ships sailing together at night relied on a small, deliberately limited vocabulary of lantern signals, since anything more elaborate risked being misread in the dark or, worse, understood by whoever they were trying to avoid. A single lantern hoisted at a specific point in the rigging might mean simply hold your course. 2, spaced a certain distance apart, might signal a change in heading, or trouble aboard, or a sighted sail worth investigating. The exact code varied from fleet to fleet and captain to captain, agreed on verbally before ever setting sail. And a new hand aboard spent his first weeks memorizing it the way he'd memorize any other survival skill, because misreading a signal in poor visibility could scatter a fleet, or worse, send one ship crashing into another in the dark. Tonight, sailing alone rather than as part of a larger fleet, none of that signalling matters much, but every man aboard who's served on a ship travelling in company knows the code regardless, filed away with the rest of the knowledge nobody teaches formally, but everybody's expected to already have. Theft aboard ship carries a weight that's easy to underestimate from the outside, because on a vessel this crowded, where every man's possessions amount to whatever fits in a single sea chest, stealing from a crewmate isn't a minor infraction. It's treated, under most cruise articles, as an offence nearly as serious as desertion or cowardice in a fight. A man caught stealing from the common plunder, rather than from an individual crewmate, faced particularly harsh consequences under several surviving sets of articles, sometimes marooning, sometimes having an ear or nose slit as a permanent visible mark that followed him to whatever ship or port he ended up in next. The logic, harsh as it sounds, follows directly from how thin the margin for trust actually is on a ship like this one. 80 men sharing one small deck cannot function if any of them believes the others are quietly stealing from the common stores. The punishment isn't really about the stolen object. It's about preserving the fragile, deliberately engineered trust that keeps this many armed, often desperate men from turning on each other the moment the discipline slips. Down near the powder room, a boy of about 13 named Sam Otter, pressed, like Ned, from a captured merchant vessel some months back, though considerably more cheerful about his situation than his age might suggest, sits half awake beside the ship's limited store of gunpowder, his job for tonight nothing more dramatic than making sure no one brings an open flame anywhere near it. Powder monkeys like Sam exist on nearly every armed vessel of this era, chosen young in part because a smaller, quicker body could move powder charges up from below during a fight faster than a grown man burdened with other duties. Tonight there's no fight, so Sam's job amounts to sitting quietly in the dark, listening for footsteps, and staying awake, a task that sounds simple and is, by his own quiet admission to anyone who asks, the hardest part of his whole day. He passes the hours the way most bored 13-year-olds on any ship in any century eventually learn to, humming half-remembered tunes under his breath, low enough that no one comes to tell him to stop. Measuring speed at night relies on a simple, almost elegant piece of equipment called the log line, a length of knotted rope with a weighted wooden board at one end, thrown overboard and allowed to run out freely while a sailor times its unspooling against a small sand glass, usually running 28 or 30 seconds. Counting the knots that pass through his hand in that interval gives a rough but genuinely useful measure of the ship's speed, a practice so foundational to seafaring that the word knot, still used today for a ship's speed in nautical miles per hour, comes directly from this exact method. Combined with a compass heading and a rough sense of elapsed time since the last confirmed position, this simple measurement is what lets the ship's navigator maintain something called dead reckoning, an estimated position built up hour by hour through the night, inherently imprecise, prone to accumulating error with every mile sailed, and yet the single most important piece of information keeping the ship from running blind onto rocks or shoals nobody aboard can actually see in the dark. It's a fragile kind of confidence, built from rope, sand, and careful counting, and it's the only kind available. Down near the ship's small store of cannon, the master gunner makes his own quiet rounds through the middle watch, checking that the powder charges stay dry and that nothing has shifted loose enough to become dangerous if the ship rolls hard in unexpected weather. It's unglamorous, repetitive work, running a hand along tackle lines, confirming a tarpaulin cover hasn't slipped, listening for anything that sounds wrong in the dark, but a cannon that can't fire when it's needed, or worse, one that fires accidentally from a spark it should never have been exposed to, kills the crew just as effectively as an enemy broadside would. Wet powder, ruined by a leak nobody caught in time, has ended more than one pirate encounter before it properly began, the ship reduced to bluffing its way through a confrontation with guns that, if truly tested, wouldn't fire at all. Tonight, everything checks out dry and secure, and the gunner moves on to the next piece, one more small, invisible task keeping the whole fragile machine of the ship functioning through hours when almost everyone else aboard is trying, one way or another, to rest. The ship's own bell, the one struck every half hour through this entire night, hangs from a small wooden frame near the main hatch. Cast in bronze by a foundry whose name most of the crew couldn't tell you, inscribed, as was common practice, with the ship's name and the year she was built. It's a small, unremarkable object in the middle of an ordinary night. Nobody aboard tonight thinks of it as anything more than the thing that marks time, struck and struck again until the watch changes and someone else takes over the counting. But a ship's bell, on vessels across this entire era, tends to outlast almost everything else built into the hull around it. Long after the wood has rotted or burned or splintered against a shoal, bronze survives the sea largely intact, sometimes for centuries, sitting on the ocean floor with its inscription still legible under enough patient cleaning. It's the kind of object that means nothing in particular tonight, doing nothing more than telling 80 tired men how many hours remain before their watch ends. And everything, decades or centuries later, to anyone lucky and careful enough to find it. Not every ship's last quiet night ended in a squall that passed. Some ended with the sunrise itself as the enemy, and roughly a year and a half after the Wider went down, another famous pirate captain would spend what turned out to be his final night on Earth not fighting a storm at all, but simply failing to notice the danger closing in from the dark water nearby. He is drinking with a merchant ship's captain, and he has no idea this is the last night of his life. It's the evening of November 21st, 1718, at anchor inside Ocracoke Inlet on the coast of what is now North Carolina, and the man laughing over a shared bottle aboard a small sloop is Edward Thatch, better known to history then and now as Blackbeard. His crew has shrunk to somewhere around 20 men, a a fraction of the hundreds he once commanded, and he has, by his own account to colonial officials, formally accepted a royal pardon and retired from piracy some months earlier. 2 armed sloops under the command of a Royal Navy lieutenant named Robert Menard are, at this exact moment, anchored just a few miles away, having sailed down from Virginia specifically to end his career permanently. Blackbeard, so far as any surviving record indicates, does not yet know they're there. By this time tomorrow, he will be dead, and his head will be hanging from Maynard's bowsprit. Tonight, he's just having a drink. This is the story of Blackbeard's last night, the one part of his legend that doesn't need Charles Johnson's embellishments to be extraordinary, because the trial depositions and Maynard's own accounts survive largely intact. Edward Thatcher's origins before piracy are genuinely obscure, probably born in Bristol, England, sometime in the 1680s, though even that much is disputed among historians working from thin and sometimes contradictory records. What's better documented is his career from around 1716 onward, serving first under the established pirate captain Benjamin Hornigold, the same man whose crew Bellamy would later leave to become his own captain, before striking out with his own command. His defining ship, and the vessel most associated with his legend, was Queen Anne's Revenge, originally a French slave ship called La Concorde, which Blackbeard's fleet captured off the island of Martinique in November 1717 and refitted into a floating fortress carrying somewhere around 40 cannons, an enormous armament for a pirate vessel of this era. With that ship, in May 1718, Blackbeard did something almost no pirate before or since attempted. He blockaded the harbour of Charleston, South Carolina, holding several ships and their passengers hostage until the city delivered a chest of medicine, then simply released everyone and sailed away. It's one of the more oddly specific ransom demands in pirate history. Not gold, not jewels, but medical supplies, likely reflecting the very real toll disease was taking on his crew. Not long after, in June 1718, Queen Anne's Revenge ran aground and was lost near what's now Beaufort, North Carolina, deliberately some historians argue, so Blackbeard could thin out his crew and keep a larger share of the plunder for a smaller circle of men. Among those he reportedly left behind on a sandbar during that reduction was a sailor named Israel Hands. Israel Hands deserves a moment of his own, because his relationship with Blackbeard illustrates something important about the difference between a captain's public menace and a crew's actual daily experience of him. According to testimony given during later piracy trials, Blackbeard, drinking one evening below decks with Hands and another crewman, reportedly blew out the candle, drew 2 pistols under the table, and fired, striking Hands in the knee and crippling him for life. When asked why, Blackbeard is said to have replied that if he didn't shoot one of his men now and then, they'd forget who he was. That story comes down to us primarily through Johnson's general history, so hold it with the usual grain of salt reserved for that source, but it fits a documented pattern of Blackbeard's leadership style that appears elsewhere in more reliable records too. He ruled less through the consultative, articles-based structure some other pirate crews used, and more through a carefully cultivated terror. Lit slow matches braided into his beard during boardings, a reputation deliberately built to end fights before they started. It worked. Merchant ships surrendered to Blackbeard's mere approach with striking regularity, in part because the alternative, actually fighting him, seemed unthinkable. Israel Hands survived his captain, oddly enough, pardoned along with several other crew members before the final confrontation at Ocracoke. He reportedly lived out his later years in London, according to Johnson's account, in genuine poverty, sometimes begging on the street, a deflating, almost mundane ending for a man who once sailed under the most feared pirate flag in the Atlantic. By the autumn of 1718, Blackbeard had accepted a royal pardon under North Carolina's Governor Charles Eden, and settled, at least in appearance, into a quieter life near the town of Bath, reportedly even marrying a local woman, according to some contemporary accounts. Colonial correspondence from the period, including letters connecting him to Eden's own secretary, Tobias Knight, suggests strongly that Blackbeard maintained profitable, likely corrupt relationships with local officials who benefited from turning a blind eye to his continued, smaller-scale plundering even after his supposed retirement. That arrangement is precisely what drew the attention of Virginia's governor, Alexander Spotswood, who had no jurisdiction in North Carolina, but sent Lieutenant Robert Maynard and 2 armed sloops anyway, determined to end Blackbeard's career even if it meant operating outside his own colony's borders. Maynard's ships arrived off Ocracoke Inlet on the evening of November 21, deliberately keeping their distance and staying out of sight, while Blackbeard, aboard his own small sloop with a skeleton crew reduced further by desertion and by men sent ashore, spent the evening drinking with the captain of a nearby merchant vessel. Whether Blackbeard genuinely had no idea the naval sloops were nearby, or simply underestimated them, remains unclear from the surviving record. What's certain is that he didn't run, didn't prepare any special defence, and by all accounts spent his final ordinary night the same way he'd spent countless others, drinking, laughing, entirely unaware of the 2 vessels riding at anchor a few miles off in the dark. Dawn on November 22 broke grey and still, and Maynard's 2 sloops began working their way through the inlet's shallow, treacherous channel toward Blackbeard's anchored vessel. What followed was less a naval engagement than a close, brutal brawl. Blackbeard's crew, though badly outnumbered, fought with the kind of ferocity that comes from men who know a hanging almost certainly awaits capture. Maynard's own account, filed afterward with colonial authorities, and among our most reliable surviving sources for this entire episode, describes Blackbeard and Maynard meeting directly in hand-to-hand combat on the deck, pistols fired at close range, cutlasses drawn. By the fight's end, Blackbeard was dead, having sustained wounds later described in near-contemporary accounts as 5 gunshot wounds and something in the range of 20 sword cuts, numbers that later retellings sometimes inflate further, so treat the upper range of that count as legend accumulating around an already remarkable death rather than a precise medical tally. Maynard, following instructions and the grim conventions of the era, ordered Blackbeard's head severed and hung from the bowsprit of his sloop as proof of the kill, sailing back to Virginia to collect the reward, a bounty of £100 specifically authorised for Blackbeard by proclamation, recorded in Virginia's colonial records, with lesser amounts set for his officers and crew. The stories that grew up afterward, that his headless body swam several times around the ship before finally sinking, belong squarely to folklore, the kind of embellishment that attaches itself naturally to any death this sudden and this violent. What actually happened needed no embellishment. A man who had, by careful design, made himself into the most feared name on the Atlantic died on an ordinary morning over a dispute about jurisdiction, having spent his last night simply drinking with a friend who had no idea what was coming either. Contemporary descriptions of Blackbeard, recorded by people who genuinely encountered him rather than invented decades later, describe a tall man with an enormous black beard, worn long and reportedly plaited into small braids tied off with coloured ribbon. Before a boarding action, by these same accounts, he tucked slow-burning cannon fuses beneath his hat, lit at both ends, so that smoke curled up around his face throughout the fight, a deliberately theatrical effect designed, much like Bartholomew Roberts' crimson waistcoat, to make surrender feel like the only sane choice available to whoever was looking at him across a closing gap of water. It worked, by most accounts, almost every single time it was tried. Merchant crews who might otherwise have put up a real fight against a smaller or better armed vessel routinely struck their colours the moment Blackbeard's silhouette became recognisable, smoke curling from his hat, cutlasses and pistols visibly strapped across his chest. The reputation did the fighting, so the actual weapons rarely had to. The Charleston blockade in May 1718 deserves a closer look than its brief summary suggests, because the hostages Blackbeard took included a man named Samuel Wragg, a member of South Carolina's governing council, along with his young son. A genuinely high-value captive, whose presence likely explains why the colony moved as quickly as it did to meet Blackbeard's demands. For nearly a week, several ships and dozens of passengers sat under armed guard, while Blackbeard's crew waited for the promised chest of medicine to arrive from shore, a demand colonial officials, found strange enough to record with some bafflement in their own correspondence, since gold or jewels would have been the expected ask. When the medicine finally arrived, Blackbeard released his hostages, stripped of most of their belongings but otherwise unharmed, and sailed away without further violence, a resolution that, whatever else it says about him, suggests a captain more interested in a specific practical outcome than in wanton cruelty for its own sake. The relationship between Blackbeard and North Carolina's Governor Charles Eden, hinted at through surviving correspondence involving Eden's secretary Tobias Knight, points toward an arrangement uncomfortably close to official corruption. A pardoned pirate allowed to continue small-scale plundering, essentially unmolested. In exchange, historians generally suspect, for a quiet share of the profits flowing to well-placed local officials. It's a detail that complicates the tidy story of a reformed pirate settling into honest retirement, and it's very likely part of why Governor Spotswood of Virginia felt justified sending Maynard into another colony's waters without permission. A jurisdictional overreach that would have been scandalous on its own, if the target hadn't been quite so infamous. Several of Blackbeard's surviving crew members, captured during or after the Ocracoke fight, were later tried in Virginia. Most were convicted and hanged, though a small number, including Israel Hands, secured pardons after testifying against Tobias Knight regarding his suspected dealings with the pirates. A final, practical betrayal that likely saved Hans's life. Before he was Blackbeard, Edward Thatch spent his early piratical career as one of several captains sailing loosely under Benjamin Hornigold's informal command out of Nassau, part of the same pirate republic ecosystem that would later shelter Samuel Bellamy's crew as well. A reminder that the more famous names of this era's piracy weren't operating in isolation from each other so much as moving through the same small, overlapping world of harbours, crews, and captains, splitting off and recombining as opportunity and disagreement dictated. When Hornigold, like Bellamy's crew before him, balked at attacking English shipping specifically, on grounds of lingering loyalty to the crown, Thatch struck out on his own, and it was only after that split that the beard, the reputation, and the name Blackbeard began to take the shape history remembers. It's worth noting, too, that the 100 reward Virginia's government eventually paid out for Blackbeard's death came with a matching tiered scale for his officers and crew, smaller sums for lesser figures, the entire structure recorded in colonial proclamations with the same careful, itemised precision a modern bounty program might use. Piracy, for everyone involved on both sides of the law, was ultimately a transaction, tallied in pounds and pieces of 8, right down to the smallest crew member captured. Maynard's approach to Blackbeard's anchored sloop that final morning required a specific kind of tactical patience, dictated entirely by the shallow, treacherous water inside Ocracoke Inlet. His 2 sloops, larger and better armed than anything Blackbeard commanded that day, still had to feel their way carefully through water too shallow in places for their draft, running aground briefly during the approach itself according to Maynard's own account, which nearly turned a planned ambush into a stalled, exposed target sitting in full view of Blackbeard's crew. It's a detail easy to lose beneath the drama of the fight that followed, but it mattered enormously to how the battle actually unfolded. Blackbeard, watching Maynard's sloop struggle in the shallows, reportedly ordered his own crew to open fire while the Navy vessels were still working themselves free, inflicting real casualties before Maynard's men ever closed the distance for the hand-to-hand. Fight that would ultimately end Blackbeard's life. Geography, in other words, nearly won the engagement for the pirates before it properly began, and the eventual outcome owed as much to Maynard's stubborn persistence through a genuinely difficult approach as it did to the close combat that followed. The small crew Blackbeard commanded that final night didn't shrink by accident. Some weeks earlier, after Queen Anne's Revenge ran aground near Beaufort, Blackbeard reportedly marooned a substantial portion of his own crew, somewhere around 25 men by most accounts, on a small, isolated sandy island nearby, taking only a smaller circle of trusted men along with the bulk of the plunder aboard the sloops that remained seaworthy. The men left behind were eventually rescued by another pirate captain passing through the area, but the episode reveals something colder about Blackbeard's leadership than his fearsome reputation alone suggests. where captains like Bartholomew Roberts governed through a council every man had a voice in, Blackbeard appears to have made this particular calculation alone, unilaterally, treating 24 of his own men as an expense to be shed, rather than partners whose consent was ever required. It's a sharp contrast worth holding on to, sitting here at the end of his story. 2 captains, roughly contemporary, both wildly successful by the brutal measure of their trade, and yet governing their crews through almost opposite philosophies. One built on terror and unilateral decision, the other on vote and written agreement. Both men ended up dead within a few years of each other. Only one of them, notably, was betrayed by nobody among his own crew at the very end. Fear like Blackbeard cultivated with a lit match and a loaded pistol is only one way to hold a ship together through the night, and on plenty of other pirate vessels. In that same decade, the thing keeping 80 armed men from each other's throats after dark had nothing to do with terror at all, and everything to do with the sky. The wake glows tonight, faint streaks of pale green-blue light trailing off the hull every time the ship cuts through a swell, and if you've never seen this before, your first instinct, like most sailors across most of history, is to assume something supernatural is happening. It isn't, quite. What you're watching is bioluminescence, tiny marine organisms disturbed by the ship's movement and lighting up in response. A real and fully natural phenomenon that has nonetheless convinced sailors for centuries that the sea itself was trying to tell them something. On a ship this superstitious, and nearly every ship of this era was, a glowing wake gets interpreted, debated, and occasionally argued over by lantern light. Some hands take it as a good omen, a sign of a fortunate voyage ahead. Others read exactly the same light as a warning, evidence of spirits stirred up beneath the hull. Nobody aboard tonight has any real way to settle the disagreement, so it simply becomes one more piece of shared, half-anxious folklore passed from older sailors to newer ones, generation after generation, correct or not. Here's the thing about superstition on a ship like this. It isn't really about the supernatural at all, not most of the time. It's about control, or the illusion of it, on a vessel where genuine control over your own survival is often close to zero. Whistling is forbidden tonight, and has been forbidden on ships across most of maritime history, for a reason that sounds almost childish stated plainly. Sailors across multiple centuries and multiple nations believed that whistling aboard ship could summon a storm, competing with and possibly angering the wind itself. The one traditional exception, ironically, was during a dead calm, when a sailor desperate for any wind at all might risk a careful, quiet whistle specifically to try to call one up, proof that even a superstition this widespread came with its own internal loopholes, worked out through generations of trial, error, and near misses nobody could actually explain. Women aboard ship carried a similar, deeply held taboo, blamed across centuries of sailor folklore for supposedly angering the sea and bringing bad luck to a voyage. And yet the historical record includes real, documented exceptions that undercut the taboo entirely. Anne Bonny and Mary Read, 2 women who sailed and fought as pirates in the early 1720s, dressed in men's clothing and fully participating in combat, were tried and convicted as pirates in their own right in 1720. Their gender revealed only during court proceedings, proof that a superstition, however widely repeated, rarely survives contact with a woman determined enough to ignore it. Superstitions, in other words, were never quite as absolute as the sailors reciting them liked to claim. A flat calm is, by most sailors' own testimony, more frightening than almost any storm, because a storm at least eventually passes, while a calm can simply continue, sails hanging slack, no progress made, water and food rations dwindling day after identical day, with no way to hurry the wind along. The doldrums, that band of unpredictable calm near the equator, earned a reputation across the age of sail as a place ships and their crews genuinely died in, not from violence but from slow, grinding attrition, thirst, spoiled food, and the particular psychological strain of being trapped somewhere with no visible cause and no predictable end. Tonight the wind holds steady, if light, and nobody aboard has to reckon with that particular fear. But every experienced hand aboard has a story about a calm that lasted a week or two, or in the telling of the oldest sailors, likely exaggerated with each retelling, nearly a month, rations counted out in smaller and smaller portions each day, while the sails hung motionless against a sky that refused to cooperate. It's a useful reminder that the ocean didn't need a storm to be dangerous. Sometimes the absence of anything happening at all was the threat, and there was nothing a crew, however well organised, however fairly governed by whatever articles they'd signed, could actually do about it except wait. Higher up in the rigging, a faint blue-white glow flickers briefly at the very tip of the mainmast, there and gone in a matter of seconds, and the sailor nearest the mast crosses himself without entirely meaning to. What he's seeing is St. Elmo's fire, a real electrical phenomenon caused by a strong electric field in the atmosphere, most commonly noticed just before or during a thunderstorm, igniting a faint plasma glow around a pointed object like a mast tip. Sailors across centuries and cultures, entirely independently of each other, interpreted this same real phenomenon as a supernatural sign, often naming it after a patron saint of sailors and reading it as either a blessing or a warning, depending on the circumstances and the mood of the crew watching it. Nobody aboard tonight has the physics to explain what they just saw, and even if someone tried, it likely wouldn't matter much to how the crew reacts. A glow appearing out of nowhere on the tip of your own mast, at night, in the middle of open ocean, is going to feel meaningful whether or not anyone can name the electrical principle behind it. Josiah Rook, making his rounds, touches a small worn coin he keeps in his coat pocket, a habit, not quite a prayer, that he performs every time something on this ship reminds him how little control any of them actually have. It passes as quickly as it came, and the ship sails on, unbothered and unharmed. When a man dies aboard ship at night, the crew doesn't wait for morning out of sentiment. The body simply can't stay in the crowded, warm space below decks for long in this climate. What follows is a specific, practiced ritual, documented consistently enough across naval and merchant accounts of the era to be considered standard practice rather than folklore. The body is sewn into its own hammock, weighted with cannonballs or scrap iron at the feet to ensure it sinks. And, in the detail modern listeners tend to find most unsettling, the final stitch of the shroud is traditionally passed through the nose or septum of the deceased, an old sailor's practical safeguard meant to confirm unmistakably that the man being committed to the sea is actually dead and not merely unconscious. It's a grim little piece of craftsmanship, and the sailmaker or whoever performs the task tonight does it without much visible emotion, because emotion, on a ship where death is a recurring and practical logistical problem rather than a rare tragedy, has to be rationed carefully. A brief reading, if anyone aboard can manage one from memory, a few words about the man's service, and then the body goes over the side. Usually at first light, rather than in full dark, though the sewing and preparation often happens through the night hours when there's little else demanding attention. Nobody on this particular ship dies tonight. But every man aboard has performed this exact ritual before, for someone whose name they still remember, and the knowledge of it sits quietly under everything else happening on deck. Navigation after dark relies on the stars in a way that modern sailors, spoiled by satellite positioning, rarely have to think about at all. A ship's navigator, often the captain himself or whoever aboard has the mathematical training for it, uses an instrument called a backstaff or cross-staff to measure the angle of the North Star above the horizon, calculating the ship's latitude with reasonable accuracy even without any modern equipment. Longitude, by contrast, remains genuinely unsolvable with any real precision in this era. The marine chronometer that will eventually fix that problem is still decades away from being perfected, which means a ship like this one is, in a very real sense, only ever half certain of its own position on the globe. That uncertainty produces its own quiet comfort, oddly enough. The stars themselves are reliable even when the calculations built from them aren't. Polaris sits where it always sits. The familiar shapes wheel slowly overhead through the night exactly as they did the night before, and the night before that. offering a kind of fixed point in a life that otherwise offers almost none. Ned Carrow, back on watch again after a few hours' broken sleep, finds himself doing what half the lookouts on this ship do on a clear night without quite admitting it to anyone, watching the stars not for navigation at all, but simply because they're the one part of this entire terrifying, uncertain life that hasn't changed since he was a boy back on dry land. The work songs that drift up from the deck through most of the evening aren't just entertainment, whatever they sound like from a distance. Sailors across the age of sail relied on rhythmic call and response, singing specifically to coordinate the physical labour of hauling a heavy line all together, in time. Since 80 men pulling at slightly different moments accomplish far less than 80 men pulling on the same beat. A shantyman, often a crewmate with a strong voice and a good memory for verses, sometimes made up on the spot to suit whatever job is at hand, calls a line, and the working crew answers with the chorus, timing their pull to the response. At night, with the heavy labour mostly finished, the same songs shift purpose, becoming less about coordinated work and more about simply passing the hours, verses growing longer and more elaborate the later it gets, some of them clearly improvised on the spot to mock a particular officer or commemorate a particular prize, in the loose. Half-mocking way sailors have always found to make an unbearable job slightly more bearable. The black flag flying somewhere above this ship's stern isn't the single skull and crossbones design that popular imagination has flattened every pirate flag into. Surviving accounts and depositions describe a genuinely wide variety of pirate colours across different captains and crews, full skeletons, hourglasses meant to remind a target that time was short, bleeding hearts, crossed swords, each design chosen and modified by an individual captain or crew to build a specific recognisable reputation. Blackbeard's own flag, by most reconstructions, showed a horned skeleton spearing a bleeding heart while toasting the devil. A considerably more elaborate design than the simple skull most people picture when they hear the word pirate today. The flag's real function, black or otherwise, was never decoration. Raised at the right moment, close enough for a target ship to see clearly, it delivered a message faster than any spoken demand could. Surrender now, or expect no leniency. Some crews flew a plain red flag specifically to signal that message even more starkly, red, in the maritime symbolism of the era, meaning no quarter would be given at all. A warning grim enough that it rarely needed to be tested twice by the same target ship's captain. Broader seafaring superstition, stretching well beyond this one ship or this one era, held that certain people brought bad luck simply by their presence aboard. A red-haired crewmate encountered first thing in the morning, by some accounts, or a clergyman, oddly enough, considered by many sailors an unlucky passenger to carry, perhaps from some half-remembered association between priests and funerals. None of it holds up to scrutiny, and plenty of red-headed. Thoroughly ordinary sailors served out entire careers without incident, but superstition rarely needs to be logically consistent to survive. It only needs to give frightened, exhausted men somewhere to place the blame when something goes wrong that otherwise has no explanation at all. Deception, more than open combat, was the real tool this ship relies on to approach a target unnoticed, and it had nothing to do with the supernatural at all, however much it might have felt that way to the sailors on the receiving end. Flying false colours, the flag of a friendly or neutral nation, run up the mast to disarm suspicion right up until the moment of attack, was a widely documented practice among pirate crews of this era, and one that plenty of legitimate naval vessels used too, since the laws of war at the time generally permitted flying false colours so long as a ship's true flag was raised again before actually opening fire. A target ship's watch, seeing a familiar friendly flag on an approaching vessel, would typically relax rather than prepare for a fight, and by the time the black or red colours finally went up, often at the very last possible moment, sometimes only after grappling hooks were already flying, resistance had usually become pointless. It's a small, almost theatrical piece of misdirection, no more mystical than a card trick, but on a night crossing like tonight's, when every shape on the horizon is uncertain until it's dangerously close, this same tactic works just as well in darkness as it does under a clear midday sun, perhaps even better. The moon tonight sits low and waning, giving off just enough light to navigate by without fully banishing the dark and older hands aboard treat its phase as more than simple background detail. A darker night, closer to a new moon, favours an approach on an unsuspecting target. Less light for a target's lookout to spot an incoming ship by, more cover for muffled oars and shuttered lanterns to actually work as intended. A captain planning a raid on a coastal settlement or a nighttime approach to a specific prize will, where the timing allows it, choose his date with the lunar calendar in mind, the same practical calculation that farmers and hunters ashore have made for their own purposes, across every culture, with a working knowledge of the sky. It's not superstition exactly, though it sits close enough to it that the two blur together easily in casual conversation among the crew. The moon doesn't care about pirates one way or another. But knowing its phase, and timing your actions around it, is simply good tactics dressed in the same language men have always used to talk about the night sky's influence over their fortunes. Reluctance to begin a voyage on certain days belongs to the same broad family of seafaring caution, passed down mostly through oral tradition among generations of sailors rather than any single documented origin point, so it's worth holding a little more loosely than some of tonight's other superstitions. Whatever its exact roots, the underlying instinct is a familiar one by now. Sailors facing genuinely unpredictable danger, with no reliable way to forecast the weather that might kill them, built an entire private calendar of lucky and unlucky choices, less because the choices themselves carried any real power, and more because having any system at all, however unprovable, felt better than facing an indifferent ocean with no system whatsoever. Tonight's ship set out on an unremarkable day by anyone's reckoning, and nobody aboard seems especially troubled by it. But ask any 10 men on this deck what day they'd never willingly choose to weigh anchor, and most of them, without much hesitation, will give you the same answer. Proof, if nothing else, that some fears travel faster and further through a crew than any actual evidence ever could. Stars fix a position, but they don't decide who's in charge of the ship sailing beneath them, and on a night not so different from this one, a different crew, a few years earlier, gathered by lantern light to settle exactly that question. The only way pirates ever really settled anything, by vote. The candles gutter low in the great cabin, and 30-some men are crowded shoulder to shoulder in a space meant for a captain and maybe 3 officers, waiting to hear whether the man standing at the front of the room will accept what they are about to offer him. It's June 1719, off the small island of Principe in the Gulf of Guinea, and the crew's previous captain, Howell Davis, has just been killed hours earlier in an ambush, lured ashore by the island's Portuguese governor under false pretenses and shot down before he could reach his boat. The crew, now leaderless and vulnerable, needs a new captain before morning, and by long-established pirate custom, that decision belongs to every man in the room equally, cast by open vote, right now, tonight. The man they choose is Bartholomew Roberts, a reluctant, relatively recent addition to the crew, a Welsh sailing master with a reputation for careful navigation but no particular history of leadership. He reportedly hadn't even wanted to turn pirate in the first place, having been forced into the trade only weeks earlier when his own merchant ship was captured. Within 2 years, he will become the most successful pirate captain of the entire Golden Age, credited with taking somewhere north of 400 vessels before his own death in 1722. This is the story of the vote that made him, and of the written articles that governed nearly everything he and his crew did afterward. The articles a crew like this one drew up and signed before setting out weren't a single universal document. Each ship's crew wrote and agreed to its own, though the surviving examples, preserved mainly again through Johnson's general history and treated with appropriate caution about exact wording, share a strikingly consistent underlying logic. Every man got a vote on major decisions: where to sail, which ships to attack, when to fight and when to run. Every man got a roughly equal share of whatever plunder the voyage produced, with the captain and quartermaster typically receiving a larger cut, commonly 1.5 to 2 shares against everyone else's single share, as compensation for greater risk and responsibility, not as an unquestioned birthright the way a naval or merchant hierarchy would have assigned it. Injury compensation, as Josiah Rook's own missing fingers illustrate on a different ship entirely, was often written directly into these documents. A specific sum, sometimes cited in the surviving articles as roughly 800 pieces of 8, for the loss of a leg or an arm, lesser but still meaningful amounts for lesser injuries, paid out of the common plunder before any other shares were distributed. It's worth pausing on how genuinely unusual that was. A sailor maimed in Royal Navy service in this same era had no comparable guarantee at all, and depended entirely on the mercy of a pension system that was, by most historical accounts, chronically underfunded and slow to pay even the meagre sums it did occasionally allow. None of this made pirate life fair, or safe, or kind. But it made it, in this one specific and remarkable way, more just than almost any other seafaring life available to an ordinary sailor in 1719. Discipline under Roberts's articles reportedly extended into exactly the kind of small, practical rules that governed the rest of tonight's ship as well. Lights and candles out after 8, gambling for money forbidden, no boys or women allowed aboard, specifically to reduce the disputes and violence that competition over scarce companionship might otherwise cause. A rule that, notably, Anne Bonny and Mary Red's own service elsewhere proves wasn't universal across every crew, but does appear consistently enough in the surviving articles to suggest it reflected a genuine, widely shared concern. Breaking the articles carried consequences that scaled with the offence, and the harshest documented punishment, marooning, appears in the historical record as a genuine practice rather than pure legend. A man judged guilty of serious theft from the crew, desertion in the face of a fight, or bringing a woman aboard disguised against the rules, could be set ashore on some isolated spit of sand with little more than a pistol, a small amount of shot and powder, and a bottle of water, a sentence that amounted, in practice if not in explicit intent, to a slow death by exposure or thirst, softened only marginally by the pistol's obvious alternative use. It's a harsh system by any modern measure, but every man aboard had agreed to it, by vote, before a single article was violated, which is more than could be said for the punishments meted out under naval articles of war to sailors who'd never been offered any vote on the rules governing their own bodies at all. Roberts, once elected, proved to be an unexpectedly gifted commander, disciplined, strategically careful, and by most surviving accounts personally abstemious in a way that set him apart from many of his crew, reportedly preferring tea to rum and keeping regular hours even at the height of a successful voyage. Under his command, the crew took prize after prize with startling efficiency. Among the more famous captures was a Portuguese vessel, the Sagrada Familia, taken off Brazil in 1719 loaded with sugar, gold and jewels intended for the Portuguese crown, a haul substantial enough on its own to make every man aboard, at least briefly, extraordinarily wealthy. Boarding actions like that one often happened at dusk or in the early hours of darkness specifically, because visibility favoured the attacker over the defender. A target ship's watch, straining to make out an approaching vessel in fading light, frequently mistook Roberts's ships for friendly traffic, until it was far too late to organise any real resistance. By the time lanterns were lit and the black flag became unmistakably visible, Roberts's men were already alongside, and most captains, weighing the odds correctly, chose surrender over a fight they had little realistic chance of winning. Roberts himself, according to multiple surviving depositions from captured prisoners, cut a genuinely striking figure in these confrontations, reportedly dressed in a crimson damask waistcoat and breeches, a red feather in his hat, a heavy gold chain with a diamond cross hanging around his neck, and 2 pairs of pistols slung across his shoulders on a silk sling. A deliberately theatrical presentation calculated, much like Blackbeard's lit matches, to end a fight through pure intimidation before it could properly begin. Roberts's extraordinary run would eventually end off the coast of what is now Gabon, in February 1722, when his ship was caught and engaged by the Royal Navy warship HMS Swallow, a battle that, unlike so much of the rest of his career, he did not survive, killed early in the exchange by grape shot to the throat. His crew, following his own standing instructions in the event of his death, reportedly threw his body overboard fully dressed in his finest clothes, rather than let it be captured and displayed, denying the Navy the trophy they'd hoped for. That ending belongs to a different night than this one, still 3 years away from the candlelit cabin off Principe where this chapter began. What matters, sitting here in the moments just after his election, is simpler. A reluctant sailing master, elected by a crowded, exhausted crew who needed someone to lead them before morning, had just become, by vote, not by birth, not by naval commission, not by royal appointment, the captain who would go on to define an entire era of piracy more thoroughly than almost any other single man. The candles in the great cabin are relit as the vote concludes, the men slowly filing back out onto the deck to resume whatever watch or duty was waiting for them. And Roberts, whatever he privately feels about the responsibility just placed on him, has until morning to become the captain his crew just decided, unanimously, that they needed him to be. Hal Davis's death, the event that made this vote necessary in the first place, is worth its own brief accounting, because it illustrates a danger pirates faced constantly and rarely get credit for navigating. Not naval warships or storms, but simple personal treachery from shore. The governor of Princeby had invited Davis and several of his officers ashore under the pretense of a friendly dinner, only to spring an ambush the moment they were separated from their ship's guns and their own armed crew. Davis was shot down attempting to flee back to his boat, and several officers with him were killed or captured alongside him. It's a reminder that a pirate crew's greatest vulnerability was rarely the fight everyone expected. Cannons and cutlasses, most experienced captains understood, were survivable risks that could be planned for. A friendly-seeming invitation from an official with every reason to want a pirate captain dead was considerably harder to guard against, and Davis's death, whatever else it cost his crew, taught Roberts a caution about shore invitations that likely extended his own career considerably longer than it might otherwise have lasted. At his peak, Roberts commanded a small fleet built around a flagship he named, with a bluntness that suited his reputation, the Royal Fortune, a name he reportedly reused for several successive ships across his career, each one larger and more heavily armed than the last as his fortunes grew. Estimates drawn from surviving prize records and depositions credit Roberts and his crews with capturing somewhere in the range of 400 vessels over roughly 3 years, a scale of plundering that dwarfs nearly every other pirate captain of the era, including men whose names have survived considerably better in popular memory. That scale came with a cost the surviving record doesn't shy away from. Among the more disturbing episodes attributed to Roberts's crew, again via Johnson's general history and appropriately flagged as a claim from that specific, sometimes unreliable source, is an account of a captured slave ship burned, with captives reportedly still aboard after a dispute over payment for the vessel broke down. Whether the full details of that account are precisely accurate or dramatized in the retelling, the underlying reality it points toward is not in serious dispute among historians. Piracy in this era existed alongside, and was sometimes directly entangled with, the same transatlantic slave trade whose ships pirates routinely captured, crewed with formerly enslaved men, and occasionally, when circumstances turned ugly, treated with the same casual brutality the slave trade itself was built on. Major decisions, which ship to chase, whether to fight or flee a warship spotted on the horizon, whether to accept a target's surrender or press an attack, typically went through what surviving accounts describe as a council of war, distinct from the captain's day-to-day authority over sailing the ship itself. Every man got a voice in this council, and the outcome bound the whole crew, including the captain, whose vote in these matters counted for exactly as much as anyone else's and no more. It's a genuinely unusual structure for a military-style organisation in 1719, closer in spirit to a town meeting than to any naval chain of command operating anywhere else in the Atlantic world at the time, and it likely explains part of why Roberts's crew stayed remarkably cohesive and effective across so many successive voyages, compared to crews under captains who ruled by fear alone and saw correspondingly higher rates of desertion and mutiny. When a grievance needed to be raised against a captain or officer without any single man taking the visible blame for starting the complaint, some pirate crews are documented to have used a device called a round robin, a petition on which every man signed his name in a circle rather than a list, specifically so no single signature could be identified as the first, and therefore no single man could be singled out afterward as the ringleader. It's a small piece of collective political technology, invented by ordinary sailors with no legal training and no formal precedent to draw on, solving a genuinely difficult problem. How do you organise a protest on a ship where the person you're protesting against still commands, at least nominally, the power to punish insubordination? Nobody aboard tonight has cause to draft one, but every man here knows the practice exists, filed away with the rest of a pirate crew's working knowledge of how to hold power accountable from below, a body of practical improvised governance that had no equivalent anywhere else at sea in this entire century. It's worth clearing up one piece of popular pirate mythology directly, here where the ship's actual disciplinary system is under discussion. Walking the plank, the image most people picture immediately when they hear the word pirate punishment has essentially no solid grounding in the historical record of this era at all. No Admiralty trial deposition, no captain's log, no contemporary newspaper account from the actual Golden Age describes it happening. The practice appears to be almost entirely a later invention, popularised by 19th century novelists and considerably later by film, layered backward onto a period that never actually practised it. What real pirate crews did instead, when a serious enough offence demanded serious enough punishment, was maroon a man, setting him ashore on an isolated spit of land with minimal supplies, a sentence considerably crueler in practice than the quick, dramatic version popular fiction prefers, precisely because it was slow and because it was real. The truth, as is often the case with this era, turns out to be both less cinematic and more genuinely unsettling than the legend that eventually replaced it in the popular imagination. Not every man taken prisoner during a capture ended up with a genuine choice about joining the crew that took him, whatever the pirate code's own stated ideals might suggest. Skilled tradesmen, carpenters, navigators, and above all surgeons, whose training took years and whose skills were desperately scarce aboard most pirate crews, were routinely pressed into service regardless of their own wishes. The crew simply too dependent on the specific expertise to let a useful man sail away with his old ship. Peter Scudamore's own presence aboard this vessel tonight traces back to exactly that calculation, made by a previous crew's vote months before he ever met Josiah Rook or any of the men currently sleeping in hammocks below him. It's an uncomfortable asterisk on the whole system of consensual governance this chapter has spent so much time describing, and it's worth naming honestly rather than smoothing over. A ship's articles could guarantee a vote, an equal share, and a genuine say in council to every man who signed them, while still, in the same breath, denying an unlucky few, a talented surgeon, a skilled pilot like John Julian, the basic freedom to decide whether to sign at all. A vote decides who leads a ship. It decides nothing about who tends the men that leadership sends into a fight, and below decks, on countless pirate vessels, including the one we started this night on, that job fell to a man who'd often had no vote at all in whether he was there. The hammock sways with the ship's roll, a slow, rhythmic pendulum motion that, once you stop fighting it, becomes almost soothing, which is fortunate, because it's roughly all the comfort on offer down here. You're back aboard the same sloop we started the night on, deep in the small hours now, packed into a lower deck with dozens of other men, each allotted a strip of canvas roughly 14 inches wide, slung so close to your neighbours on either side that a bad roll of the ship sends you all swinging in the same direction at once. The air down here is thick and warm in a way that has nothing pleasant about it. No ventilation beyond a single open hatch. The accumulated breath and body heat of 80 men with nowhere for any of it to go. Some crews, on ships even more crowded than this one, resorted to what sailors called hot bunking, men on opposite watches sharing the exact same hammock in shifts, one climbing out cold and stiff just as the other climbs in still warm from the man before him. It's not documented as universal practice, but it's documented often enough, on ships carrying more crew than berths, to have been a genuine and unremarkable part of shipboard life for plenty of sailors in this era. Tonight at least there are just enough hammocks to go around. Illness moves through a ship like this one differently than it moves through a town, because there's nowhere for it to go and no way to isolate it once it starts. Scurvy is the slow, familiar dread every long voyage sailor carries somewhere in the back of his mind, a disease caused, though nobody aboard tonight has the vitamin C science to explain it correctly, by prolonged absence of fresh fruit and vegetables, producing bleeding gums, loosened teeth, exhaustion, and, left untreated for months, death. Some captains, entirely through empirical trial and error, rather than any real understanding of the underlying cause, had noticed that crews supplied with citrus fruit on longer voyages seemed to fare noticeably better, and stocked limes or lemons when they could get them, a full 60 years or so before the Royal Navy would formally adopt citrus rations as required policy. Tending to the sick and the injured tonight falls to a man named Peter Scudamore, the ship's surgeon, and like a great many pirate surgeons, he didn't exactly choose this career. Skilled surgeons were valuable and genuinely rare in this era, and pirate crews frequently captured them from prize ships and compelled them to serve, sometimes making the captivity official on paper as a defence the surgeon, could later use in his own trial, should he ever be caught and prosecuted alongside the crew he'd been forced to treat. Scudamore has one small distinctive habit that every man aboard who's ever been under his needle has come to recognise. He hums old hymns, quietly and half under his breath, while he works, whether he's setting a broken bone or something considerably worse. Nighttime rounds for a surgeon like Scudamore mean working almost entirely by lantern light, in a space this crowded, with instruments that would look crude and frightening by any later medical standard. Knives, bone saws, needles, and, for anaesthesia, such as it is, a generous dose of rum, poured directly into the patient rather than administered with any real precision. Amputation, when it becomes necessary, is fast by grim necessity rather than skill alone. A surgeon who could remove a shattered limb in under a minute gave his patient the best odds against both blood loss and the agony of the procedure itself. Rat bites, left untreated in a space this crowded and unsanitary, carry their own quiet risk of infection, one more small item on Scudamore's constant unglamorous list, alongside the larger traumas of cannon fire and cutlass wounds. He works through most of it without complaint, and without, so far as anyone aboard has ever observed, much visible resentment toward the crew that essentially conscripted him into this life. Whether that reflects genuine acceptance, or simply the practiced calm of a man who's learned that resentment changes nothing about the work in front of him, is something Scudamore himself has never volunteered to discuss. Tonight his patient is a minor one, a rope burn across a young hand, cleaned and bound without much drama. But Scudamore treats it with the same careful attention he'd give a wound 10 times worse, because on this ship tonight it's the only patient he has, and he intends to keep it that way as long as he can. It's while tending that rope burn that Scudamore, making conversation to keep the young sailor's mind off the sting of the cleaning, mentions Josiah Rook's missing fingers, not as gossip but as a kind of quiet reassurance, the closest thing this ship offers to a safety net. Rook lost those fingers 3 years ago, Scudamore explains, aboard a different vessel entirely, under a different surgeon's care, and the compensation written into that ship's articles, some 250 pieces of 8 for the injury, paid before any other shares were distributed, came through exactly as promised, no argument, no delay, the whole crew having voted the terms themselves months before Rook was ever hurt. It's a small story, but it does real work here at 2 a.m, in a crowded, sweating lower deck full of men who each, in their own way, understand exactly how close their own bodies are to the same fate. The system isn't kind, exactly. It doesn't prevent the injury, doesn't dull the pain, doesn't give Rook his fingers back. But it means that when the worst happens on a ship like this one, it happens inside a framework the injured man helped build and agreed to beforehand, not at the unaccountable mercy of a captain who owes him nothing, the way it would on almost any other ship sailing these same waters tonight. For men who signed the articles under real duress, weeks or months ago, stories like this one matter more than they might seem to from the outside. They're evidence, repeated quietly from bunk to bunk, that the system actually holds when it's tested. By comparison, and it's a comparison every experienced sailor aboard this ship has made at some point, out loud or silently, life below decks on a naval vessel of this same era ran considerably harsher. Impressment, the practice of literally seizing men off merchant ships or out of port towns and forcing them into naval service, sometimes for years at a stretch, with no vote, no share, and pay that arrived late or not at all, was a documented routine feature of British naval life throughout this period, and one of the more reliable sources of new, if unwilling, recruits for pirate crews, specifically because so many men preferred piracy's rough equality to the Navy's rigid unpaid servitude. Watch rotations aboard naval vessels followed similarly rigid schedules, but without the collective bargaining that shaped a pirate crew's own watch bill, and discipline was enforced not through consensus and shared articles but through flogging, administered by officers a common sailor had no say in appointing and no recourse against if the punishment felt unjust. It's not that a pirate ship was gentle, it absolutely was not by any modern standard, but measured against the specific, well-documented alternative most of these men had actually lived through before turning pirate, the sloop you're aboard tonight, crowded, dangerous, and often terrifying as it is, represents, for nearly every man in this hammock-packed lower deck, a genuine improvement in how much say he has over his own life. That's a low bar. It's still the bar these men were measuring against every single night. The sky beyond the open hatch has begun, almost imperceptibly, to lighten. Not dawn yet. Not for another hour or more. But that first faint shift from true black toward the deep blue-grey that always precedes it. Scudamore finishes with the rope burn, ties off the last of the bandage, and allows himself, for the first time since midnight, a few minutes to simply sit, listening to the ship breathe around him, the creak of timber, the distant rhythm of the pump, the low murmur of the watch changing somewhere above. Without the vitamin science to explain what actually caused scurvy, ship surgeons of this era worked from a patchwork of remedies passed down through tradition and trial and error, some genuinely useful and some almost entirely worthless. Tar water, pine tar steeped in fresh water and drunk as a general tonic, was a popular remedy across the whole of the 18th century for nearly every ailment a ship surgeon might encounter, from fevers to digestive complaints, despite having little to no real medicinal value beyond, perhaps, a placebo effect and the psychological comfort of feeling like something was being done. Herbal poultices, drawn from whatever fresh plants a crew had managed to trade for or capture at the last port, treated wounds and infections with a mix of genuine antiseptic properties and pure folk tradition, the two often impossible to distinguish from each other at the time. Scudamore, like most surgeons of his era, worked from all of it at once, genuine anatomical knowledge learned through apprenticeship, mixed freely with tradition that had no scientific basis whatsoever, because in a world without the tools to properly tell the difference, a surgeon used everything that seemed, from accumulated experience, to actually help. The cumulative toll of interrupted sleep across a long voyage rarely gets much attention in popular retellings of pirate life, but it shows up quietly, again and again, in surviving ships' logs from this era. Captains noting crews grown short-tempered, clumsy, prone to accidents and errors of judgment after weeks of broken 4-hour sleep cycles with no real chance to recover. A man standing the middle watch tonight, and again in 2 days, and again 4 days after that, accumulates a sleep debt that never fully resolves itself across an entire voyage, and the effects, slower reactions, worse decisions, frayed patience, likely contributed to more of the small accidents and disputes aboard ship than anyone at the time had the vocabulary to properly diagnose. It's an unglamorous kind of suffering, easy to overlook next to storms and battles, but it shaped nearly every hour of nearly every night this crew, and crews like it, spent at sea across the whole of the Golden Age. Not every patient Scudamore has treated across his time aboard has survived, and he doesn't pretend otherwise to the men who ask. A sailor named Robert Coe, taken aboard from the same captured merchantman as Ned Carrow some months back, died 3 weeks into the voyage from an infected wound Scudamore had done everything available to him to treat, the amputation performed cleanly and quickly, the stump kept as clean as conditions below decks allowed, and still, within days, the fever set in that no remedy of this era could reliably stop. Coe's payout under the ship's articles went to a brother back in Bristol, arranged through a network of contacts and correspondence that took the better part of a year to actually deliver the money, imperfect but not nothing. Scudamore still hums the same hymn, sometimes, that he was humming the night Coe died, and none of the men who've noticed it have ever asked him why. Even the captain, whose cabin offers privacy no other man aboard enjoys, sleeps under the same accountability as everyone else tonight, at least on paper. His authority to alter course, discipline a crewman for an infraction outside of combat, or make unilateral decisions about the ship's daily operation is real, but it exists within limits the crew itself voted to impose, and a captain who overstepped those limits too often, or too visibly, risked being voted out by the same process that had put him in command in the first place. It's a genuinely fragile kind of power, dependent on continued consent rather than any fixed claim to authority, and more than one pirate captain across this era learned that lesson the hard way, deposed by his own crew mid-voyage for exactly the kind of overreach a naval captain could commit without consequence. Tonight, this ship's own captain sleeps as uneasily as everyone else, for reasons that have nothing to do with the weather, and everything to do with how thin the line actually is between commanding a ship and simply being tolerated by it. Provisions get counted and rationed with a precision that borders on obsessive, because a ship out of fresh water is in considerably more immediate danger than a ship out of almost anything else. A single sailor's daily allowance in this era typically ran somewhere around a gallon of water and a pound of ship's biscuit, supplemented by whatever salted meat, dried peas, and other preserved stores the ship happened to be carrying, with quantities adjusted downward the moment a voyage ran longer than expected or a storm damaged the stores below. Keeping an accurate running count, night after night, of exactly how many days of water remain in the casks is one more small, unglamorous responsibility that falls to the quartermaster alongside everything else Josiah Rook already manages, and it's arguably the single most consequential number on the entire ship, more important in the long run than any amount of gold sitting in the hold. A crew can survive being poor. A crew genuinely cannot survive running out of fresh water several hundred miles from the nearest landfall, and every man aboard, whatever else he's forgotten about his life before piracy, remembers that arithmetic without needing to be reminded of it twice. Personal hygiene aboard a ship this crowded amounts to considerably less than modern habits would consider adequate, and lice, in particular, are treated by most sailors of this era less as a shameful affliction than as a simple, universal fact of shipboard life, no more remarkable than the rats or the weevils. Saltwater bathing, when it happens at all, tends to be functional rather than frequent. A bucket hauled up and dumped over the head on a hot day, more relief from heat than any real attempt at cleanliness, since fresh water is too precious to waste on washing when it might mean the difference between reaching the next landfall or not. Some men carry a small wooden or bone comb specifically for working lice eggs out of hair and beard, a nightly or near-nightly ritual performed by lantern light in whatever spare minutes the watch schedule allows, and it's common enough, unremarkable enough, that nobody aboard thinks twice about a crewmate quietly working through his own hair in the corner of the lower deck. It's a small, patient act of self-maintenance in conditions that offer almost none of it elsewhere, and like so much else about this ship, it gets done not because anyone particularly enjoys it, but because the alternative is worse. The popular image of a pirate dressed head to toe in stolen finery, silk waistcoats, gold rings, an ostrich feather curling off a captured hat, belongs mostly to daylight, and mostly to the moment of an actual capture, when a captain like Bartholomew Roberts had genuine tactical reasons to look as theatrically wealthy and terrifying as possible. Below decks at 2 or 3 in the morning, on an ordinary crossing with no target in sight, the same men sleep and stand watch in considerably plainer gear. Coarse wool or canvas slops, salt stiffened and patched more than once, chosen for durability rather than appearance, because fine silk survives approximately 1 storm before it's ruined beyond repair. Even Roberts himself, by every account, kept his famous crimson outfit reserved specifically for boarding actions, storing it carefully between uses rather than wearing it through the daily grind of an ordinary voyage. The theatre of piracy, in other words, was exactly that. Theatre deployed selectively, at the moment it could do the most tactical good, and set aside the rest of the time in favour of whatever kept a man warm and functional through an unglamorous night like this one. By the time the sky fully clears toward morning, this particular night's worth of small crises, a squall, a dice dispute, a rope burn, a glimpse of St. Elmo's fire on the mainmast, will have folded themselves quietly into the accumulated, mostly unrecorded history of a voyage that nobody aboard tonight will ever think to write down in any detail. That's true of almost every night like this one across the entire Golden Age of Piracy. Thousands of ordinary, undramatic hours survived rather than remembered, on ships whose names mostly never made it into any surviving log or newspaper account at all. Most of what happened aboard most pirate ships, on most ordinary nights, simply vanished the way this one nearly will, remembered by no one, recorded nowhere, gone with the men who lived it. Except, once in a very great while, the sea gives some of it back. Barry Clifford had been searching for 3 years when, in July of 1984, a diver working with his team off Marconi Beach in Wellfleet, Massachusetts, surfaced holding a small bronze ship's bell, encrusted with more than 2.5 centuries of marine growth, its inscription barely visible until careful cleaning revealed the words underneath. The Wider Galley 1716. It was the moment that turned decades of speculation about the storm-wrecked slave ship turned pirate flagship from a local Cape Cod legend into a confirmed archaeological fact. The first time in history a pirate shipwreck had been positively, physically identified with certainty rather than simply guessed at from old maps and older stories. Clifford's search had relied in part on genuinely old written evidence. The Puritan minister Cotton Mather, writing not long after the 1717 wreck, had recorded details about the disaster and its aftermath in a sermon aimed at the 2 surviving crew members awaiting trial, and colonial correspondence from Governor Samuel Chute's administration had documented the location of the wreck closely enough, combined with generations of local Cape Cod folklore about treasure buried or lost in the sand, to give Clifford's team a genuine starting point once modern, side-scan sonar technology made a systematic search finally possible. Finding that Bell didn't just answer an old question, it reopened, quite literally, a night that had been sitting on the ocean floor mostly undisturbed for 267 years. What came up out of the sand and silt in the years following that first discovery amounted to one of the largest and most significant pirate shipwreck excavations ever conducted. Tens of thousands of individual artifacts eventually recovered, including cannons, thousands of coins from a dozen different nations reflecting the truly international nature of the Wider's plundered wealth, navigational instruments, tools, and, in the detail that closes this particular circle most completely, a small human leg bone, still inside a silk stocking and a finely made child's leather shoe, later identified through forensic analysis as almost certainly belonging to John King, the boy of roughly 8 to 11 who had insisted on joining Bellamy's crew and went down with the ship that stormy night in April of 1717. It remains, to this day, one of very few instances anywhere in the archaeological record of a positively identified individual pirate victim recovered from a wreck site, a small, specific, heartbreaking confirmation of a story that had previously existed only in second-hand colonial testimony. The shoe sits today in a museum case, and it does more work in a single glance than any written account could manage on its own. It makes the number, roughly 144 dead, collapse, back down into a single child's foot, and reminds anyone standing in front of the case exactly what that number actually cost. The discovery also carried real legal weight, beyond its emotional and historical significance, because the ship's bell, recovered intact and clearly inscribed, provided undeniable physical proof of the wreck's identity. Clifford's discovery became a landmark case in American Admiralty law, one of the first instances in which a court formally and legally confirmed a specific wreck site as belonging to a documented pirate vessel, rather than treating the whole matter as unresolvable legend. That legal clarity mattered enormously for how the excavation could proceed afterward, establishing precedents around ownership, preservation, and academic access to the site that other maritime archaeologists have relied on in the decades since. Beyond the legal question, what the artifacts themselves have revealed about daily life aboard the Wider has done more to confirm the genuine documented diversity of her crew than any single written record could on its own. Bioarchaeological analysis of the recovered remains has been consistent with a crew drawn from multiple continents and backgrounds, exactly as period accounts, treated with appropriate caution, had suggested. Physical forensic confirmation of a detail that could otherwise have been dismissed as romanticized exaggeration. Today, many of the recovered artifacts are held and displayed at the Wider Pirate Museum in West Yarmouth, Massachusetts, where research on the site, remarkably, continues even now, more than 3 decades after that first bell came up out of the sand. Cotton Mather's own sermon, delivered to the 2 captured survivors while they awaited trial in a Boston jail, survives today largely because Mather himself was a prolific and meticulous record keeper, and it offers a strange, uncomfortable window into how a wreck this devastating was understood by the people closest to it in time. Mather framed the disaster less as tragedy than as divine judgment, warning his listeners, and by extension, anyone who might read the printed sermon afterward, that piracy invited exactly this kind of violent end, the storm itself recast as punishment rather than simple, indifferent weather. It's a harsh, moralizing lens, typical of the era's religious writing, and it tells us more about early 18th century New England's relationship with sin and providence than it does about the actual mechanics of what sank the ship. But it also confirms from an entirely independent source that the wreck was significant enough at the time to warrant a formal public sermon at all, one more thread in the rope that let Barry Clifford's team, more than 2.5 centuries later, find their way back to the right stretch of sand. Among the artifacts recovered from the wreck site, alongside the coins and cannon, and John King's small shoe, divers also brought up iron shackles, a grim, unavoidable reminder that the Wider, before Bellamy ever captured her, had been built and outfitted specifically for the transatlantic slave trade, designed to carry human beings against their will across the same ocean she would later go down in. It's an uncomfortable detail to sit with alongside the ship's later reputation for relative shipboard equality among her pirate crew, and it shouldn't be smoothed over. The same vessel that, under Bellamy, may have offered formerly enslaved men a genuine vote and an equal share had spent her earlier career built for the opposite purpose entirely. History rarely resolves into a single clean narrative, and the Wider's full story, slave ship, then pirate flagship, then storm grave, then archaeological treasure trove, refuses to simplify into either a straightforward villain or a straightforward tale of shipboard liberation. It's both, layered into the same hull, recovered piece by piece from the same sandbar. The excavation itself, beyond what it revealed specifically about the Wider, helped establish techniques and legal precedents that maritime archaeologists working other historic wreck sites have relied on ever since. Careful, systematic underwater mapping rather than simple treasure hunting, forensic analysis applied to human remains with the same rigour a modern crime scene would receive, and a sustained, decades-long commitment to a single site that few earlier wreck excavations had ever attempted. It set a new expectation for how a shipwreck this historically significant ought to be treated, not as a source of saleable curiosities, but as a genuine archaeological record, deserving the same patience and care any other major historical excavation would receive on land. The Wider isn't alone among Golden Age pirate vessels to eventually give up her secrets to modern archaeology. Roughly a decade after Clifford's team found that first bell, in November 1996, researchers off Beaufort, North Carolina, located the wreck of a heavily armed vessel that has since been identified, through the same kind of careful, cumulative evidence used at the Wider site, as almost certainly Blackbeard's own flagship, Queen Anne's Revenge, the same ship, run aground deliberately or otherwise back in June 1718, not far at all from the waters where her former captain would meet Lieutenant Maynard a few months later. Excavation there continues as well, cannon and anchors and personal effects surfacing slowly, decades after the ship herself went silent. Two of the most infamous pirate names of this entire era, in other words Bellamy and Blackbeard, whose separate last nights this same story has already sat with in the dark, have each eventually had their vessels found, catalogued and returned, piece by piece, to public memory. It's a strange kind of symmetry, unplanned and unlikely, and it means that the sea, having taken so much from these ships and the men aboard them, has at least occasionally been willing to give a small, careful portion of it back. Marine archaeologists working this stretch of the American coast generally agree that the Wider and Queen Anne's Revenge represent only a small fraction of what's actually down there, given how many ships from this era are documented, through colonial records and insurance claims, to have gone down along these same waters without ever being located since. Most will likely never be found at all, buried too deep in shifting sand, broken up too thoroughly by 2 or 3 centuries of storms, or simply lost in stretches of coastline too vast and too poorly charted, even now to search exhaustively. That unfinished quality is, in its own way, part of what makes the 2 successful discoveries feel as significant as they do. Every other ship like this one, every other crew that spent a night very much like the one this story has spent hours reconstructing, is still down there somewhere, unrecovered and unremembered by name, waiting on a coastline that has already proven twice now that it's willing to give its secrets back if someone looks carefully and patiently enough. Ownership of what the sea gives back hasn't come without its own long dispute. Recovering treasure and artifacts from a wreck site raises genuinely complicated legal questions about who actually owns what's found, the discoverer who spent years and considerable money locating and excavating it, or the state within whose waters it happens to lie, and the Wider's own excavation became, over the decades following its discovery, the subject of exactly this kind of prolonged negotiation between Barry Clifford's team and the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. The resolution, worked out through a combination of court rulings and negotiated agreements rather than any single dramatic verdict, ultimately allowed both ongoing excavation and public display to continue, an outcome that, whatever its legal complexity, has at least kept the site's story accessible to the public rather than locked away in a private collection somewhere. It's a fittingly unglamorous coda to a story that began with a storm and a fortune in silver, even a shipwreck this dramatic, once it's actually found, eventually comes down to paperwork, negotiation, and the slow, patient work of figuring out, generations later, who gets to keep what the ocean once took from everyone equally. What the Wider's rediscovery ultimately offers isn't a tidy resolution. The ship is still gone. The men aboard her are still dead. John King's shoe is still just a shoe sitting behind museum glass rather than a boy who got to grow up. But it offers something almost as valuable to anyone trying to understand what a single, ordinary night aboard a vessel like this one actually meant to the people living through it. Proof. Proof that the bell really was inscribed with that ship's name. Proof that the crew really was as varied as the old accounts claimed. Proof that a specific child really did climb aboard a pirate ship of his own choosing, and really did go down with her in a storm that, on any other night, might have simply passed the fleet by entirely. The popular image of piracy, the eye patches, the parrots, the treasure maps with an X marking the spot, mostly grew up decades and centuries after ships like the Wider actually sailed, layered on by novelists and filmmakers working from a kernel of real history stretched considerably past its documented shape. The reality, recovered piece by piece from a sandbar off Cape Cod, was smaller, stranger, and in its own way more remarkable than the legend. Ordinary men, and at least one extraordinary boy, living out genuinely unusual lives under a system of their own, however imperfect, negotiating for themselves what almost no one else at sea in that century ever got the chance to. Somewhere beneath all of that recovered bronze and silver, a quartermaster's worn dice and a surgeon's careful hymn. Humming hands belong to the exact same night this story began with. Different ship, different waters, but the same slow, ordinary human work of getting 80 frightened men safely from one sunset to the next sunrise. The sky over the water has gone from black to deep blue-grey to something almost silver now, and somewhere forward the lookout, not Ned tonight. His watch ended hours ago, but whoever relieved him calls down that the horizon is clear. No sail, no storm, no trouble. Just an ordinary morning arriving the way it always does, indifferent to how hard the night before it might have been. Josiah Rook is still on deck because he's always on deck, checking one last time that everything survived the dark intact before he'll finally allow himself a few hours' sleep. His 2 missing fingers ache faintly in the cool morning air, the way old injuries sometimes do, and he touches the worn coin in his pocket once, out of habit rather than any real need, before moving on. Somewhere below, Peter Scudamore is finally resting. His last patient of the night nothing worse than a rope burn, already healing. Somewhere else entirely, 200 miles north and 267 years forward all at once, a small leather shoe sits behind museum glass, holding the memory of a boy who chose this same kind of night over safety, and lost. None of these men knew, that night, which of their ordinary hours would end up remembered, and which would simply vanish into the sea along with everything else that happened and was never written down. Most nights like this one are the vanishing kind. That's not a tragedy exactly, it's just how most of history actually happened, one unremarkable watch at a time, survived rather than recorded. You're warm right now, wherever you are. You're not standing a middle watch in wet wool, straining your eyes at a dark horizon for a sail that might mean your death or your fortune. You're not 14 inches wide in a swaying hammock, breathing the same close air as 80 other exhausted men. The storm that took the Wider and her 4.5 tons of silver, the morning that took Blackbeard at Ocracoke, the candlelit vote that made a reluctant sailing master into the most successful pirate captain of his age, all of it happened a very long time ago to people whose ordinary fears and small kindnesses were every bit as real as yours are tonight, and who are, every one of them, long past needing anything from you now except to be remembered gently, for a little while before you let them go. You're warm, you're safe, tonight that's enough.